They're not aggressive southpaws, they're two boxers. But what's going to happen in this fight is that the boxing skills are going to start to cancel each other out in a game of chess very, very early on.
At 56, Adam Booth has finally done something few expected from the famously private and strategic British boxing trainer. He's named the 6 fighters he genuinely hated the most. Known as the Dark Lord of British boxing, Booth built a reputation for being calm, tactical, and composed under pressure. But beneath that icy exterior was a man who dealt with some of the sport's most difficult personalities. Over decades in boxing, Booth trained and encountered fighters whose arrogance, indiscipline, and ego tested his patience beyond limits. What fans never knew was that behind the polite interviews and the tactical breakdowns, Booth carried deep resentment towards certain boxers who he believed disrespected the sport, broke his trust, or wasted their potential. Now, after a lifetime of coaching champions and surviving countless betrayals, Booth is finally opening up. These weren't just opponents or trainees. These were men who either worked beside him or against him, and made his journey through boxing a battlefield of pride and loyalty. Booth admits that hatred in boxing isn't rare. It's an emotion built on years of frustration, competition, and broken respect. What makes his list shocking is how personal it feels. The 6 names he revealed weren't chosen lightly. Each carries a story of pride, misunderstanding, and deep wounds that time couldn't heal. From once loyal protégés who turned their backs on him to fighters he never coached but could never stand, Adam Booth's revelations show the darker side of boxing's brotherhood, where friendship turns to rivalry and rivalry turns to hate. 1. David Haye. No name defines Adam Booth's coaching career more than David Haye, and no relationship in his life caused more pain. Their journey began with ambition and ended in betrayal. Booth met Haye when he was just a young, explosive cruiserweight with dreams of conquering the world. Together, they built an empire. Booth crafted the game plans, refined Haye's style, and guided him to world championships. Their partnership seemed unbreakable, until success brought ego, money, and power into the mix. Booth was meticulous, disciplined, and strategic, while Haye thrived on confidence, instinct, and showmanship. The more Haye's fame grew, the less he listened. Booth saw the warning signs long before their split. Haye's focus shifted, his discipline faded, and arguments became daily occurrences. Their falling out reached its peak when Booth was cut out of key business decisions, a move Booth saw as pure betrayal. For him, loyalty meant everything. Haye's ambition, once admirable, now looked selfish and cold. When the two finally went their separate ways, Booth didn't just lose a fighter. He lost someone he had considered family. Years later, he described Haye as the most talented fighter I ever worked with, and the hardest to trust. That statement summed up years of emotional conflict. Even today, Booth refuses to speak much about Haye, not because he's over it, but because the pain of what they built and lost still lingers. Their story is a lesson in how success can destroy even the strongest bonds in boxing. 2. George Groves. If David Haye broke Booth's trust, George Groves shattered his patience. When Booth first took Groves under his wing, he saw a mirror image of himself, intelligent, technical, and fiercely ambitious. Groves was young, hungry, and willing to learn. Booth built his early style, guiding him through the ranks with precision. Together, they achieved victories that made Groves one of the brightest stars in British boxing. But as Groves grew in fame and confidence, tension began to boil. Booth believed Groves started seeing himself as too clever to be coached, too independent to take orders. Their relationship went from partnership to power struggle. The final straw came before Groves's rematch with Carl Froch. In Booth's eyes, Groves abandoned him when he needed him most. The trainer felt blindsided, replaced by others who promised quick success. Groves claimed he wanted to take control of his career, but to Booth, it was ego disguised as independence. The betrayal cut deep because Booth had invested years shaping Groves not just as a boxer, but as a man. When the two went their separate ways, Booth didn't hide his disappointment. He later described Groves as a fighter too smart for his own good. Their feud became symbolic, the student who believed he no longer needed the teacher. Booth's grudge toward Groves wasn't about the loss of a job, it was about the loss of respect. Even today, when asked, Booth's tone changes whenever Groves's name appears. It's not anger, but cold disillusionment. 3. Chris Eubank Jr. Few fighters tested Adam Booth's patience the way Chris Eubank Jr. did. Their short-lived partnership remains one of the most chaotic episodes of Booth's coaching career. Eubank Jr. came with pedigree, confidence, and natural athleticism, but also an unshakable belief that he already knew everything. Booth, who valued structure and discipline, found himself clashing almost immediately with Eubank's stubbornness. Every training session felt like a battle of authority. Eubank Jr. refused to follow game plans, preferred improvisation over preparation, and often ignored instructions altogether. For a strategist like Booth, that was unforgivable. To make things worse, Chris Eubank Sr. was a constant presence, observing, interrupting, and at times undermining Booth's authority. The father-son dynamic made coaching impossible. Booth later admitted that the Eubank camp was a circus I didn't sign up for. He described Jr. as talented but untrainable, someone whose ego outweighed his willingness to learn. Their collaboration didn't last long, but it left Booth frustrated enough to name Eubank Jr. as one of the few fighters he genuinely disliked working with. The experience taught Booth that raw talent means nothing without humility. When Booth finally walked away, he didn't look back. He later hinted that Eubank's downfall would come from the same arrogance that made him so difficult to coach. In Booth's world, boxing is a science, and Eubank Jr. refused to study. 4. Billy Joe Saunders. Adam Booth never officially trained Billy Joe Saunders long-term, but their paths crossed multiple times, enough for Booth to form a strong opinion. He admired Saunders' technical skill and ring IQ, but despised his lack of professionalism. Booth believed Saunders had the talent to dominate world boxing for years, yet threw it away because of arrogance and poor discipline. Booth's philosophy has always been that greatness is built in silence, through consistency and respect for the craft. Saunders, however, was the opposite: flashy, unpredictable, and often in the headlines for the wrong reasons. Booth reportedly turned down a chance to work closely with Saunders, claiming he didn't want to waste energy on a fighter who wouldn't listen. He later called him the perfect example of wasted potential. Booth couldn't stand how Saunders treated boxing like a stage rather than a sacred art. 5. Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury and Adam Booth never worked together, yet their rivalry grew through the media and mutual disdain. Booth respected Fury's boxing brilliance but despised his public persona. Fury, with his unpredictable outbursts and controversial statements, embodied a style of self-promotion Booth found unbearable. In multiple interviews, Booth criticized Fury's approach as more circus than sport. Fury fired back, calling Booth a jealous old coach who couldn't handle stars. Their exchanges were sharp, personal, and laced with real dislike. Booth saw Fury as the poster child for how boxing had lost its purity. He admired the skill but hated the showmanship. To him, Fury's antics, singing in the ring, trash-talking, and mocking opponents, reduced boxing to entertainment rather than art. 6. Carl Froch. Among Booth's most open grudges lies his distaste for Carl Froch. Their tension originated during Froch's feud with George Groves, one of Booth's former fighters. Booth took Groves's corner, and Froch saw him as the enemy. What followed was a public war of words that turned bitter fast. Booth criticized Froch's fighting style as reckless and overrated, while Froch mocked Booth as a man who hides behind mind games. The insults weren't just for show. There was genuine dislike on both sides. Booth viewed Froch as the embodiment of everything he disapproved of: arrogance, ego, and brute force over technique. During the build-up to Froch vs. Groves Y, their camps clashed repeatedly. Adam Booth's confessions reveal the raw truth behind boxing's glamour. It's not just punches and paydays. It's relationships built and broken under pressure. His 6 most hated boxers represent the many faces of betrayal, arrogance, and disillusionment that haunt the sport. From the heartbreak of losing David Haye's loyalty to the frustration of coaching uncoachable stars like Chris Eubank Jr., Booth's journey is a masterclass in how boxing can harden even the most disciplined minds. Yet, beneath the resentment, there's a trace of respect, a recognition that these very rivalries shaped his identity. Booth isn't a man fueled by bitterness, but by lessons learned the hard way. Every fighter who crossed him became part of his story, a story of loyalty tested, trust broken, and a legacy defined by honesty. At 56, Booth may finally be at peace, but the memories of those 6 fighters remain etched in his mind. Not as enemies, but as reminders of why boxing will always be a war of both fists and hearts.